Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Arizona territory. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1884, and the Arizona territory was still untamed country. Dusty trails, thin law, and long distances between safe roofs. Along the coach road between Tombstone and Florence, a small inn stood alone at a ridge called Black Creek Crossing. Travelers knew it as Widow Miller's Inn, a quiet stop for food, water, and one night's rest before pushing through the next 100 miles of hard desert. Widow Eliza Miller had run the inn for 6 years since her husband's death. She was known for her discipline, clean linens, strong coffee, and absolute silence after sundown. Locals said she never locked her doors, yet nothing ever seemed to go missing. It was a place of eerie order in a wild land. The county register first mentions the inn that spring. Good service. Fair stew, safe. But by autumn, the tone of the entries changed. A traveling salesman wrote, "The woman stares too long, as though counting breaths." Another, "No sound after supper, not even the wind." Then, in October of that year, a stagecoach carrying 5 passengers, 3 men and 2 women, stopped for the night. The driver later testified he left them at the inn near dusk and saw lamps glowing warmly in the windows. When he returned the following morning to collect his fares, the door hung open. The parlor was neat, the table still set. But the guests were gone. Their trunks, coats, and satchels remained where they'd been placed the night before. Deputy Jonas Fletcher, newly assigned from Pima County, arrived 2 days later to investigate. He found no tracks leaving the property except the stag. His own ruts. The rooms were tidy, the beds turned down, as if awaiting guests yet to arrive. The widow herself greeted him calmly, offering coffee. When asked about the travelers, she replied, "They paid in coin, sir. They left before dawn." Fletcher's report, dated October 29, 1884, noted no signs of violence. Only one strange detail: faint drag marks near the back garden, leading to a dry well. When he questioned Mrs. Miller about it, she said, "Coyotes sometimes dig there." The deputy left uneasy but unconvinced of wrongdoing. Weeks later, however, another coach passed by and found the inn locked and dark. Inside, dishes were stacked clean, chairs overturned, and no one, neither guests nor innkeeper, was ever seen again. Locals would later call it the Vanishing at Black Creek Crossing. Eliza Miller's name first appeared in Pima County records in 1878. She arrived from Missouri with her husband, Thomas Miller, a carpenter turned prospector. They purchased an abandoned trading post along the Black Creek Road, a structure of rough timber, sun-cracked shingles, and a stone hearth salvaged from Army surplus. The couple renamed it Miller's Inn and began hosting travelers drawn by the promise of safer passage between settlements. In those early years, neighbors described the Millers as quiet, respectable folk. Thomas was often seen mending fences or riding into Florence for supplies. Eliza tended a vegetable garden and kept hens. But something changed in the spring of 1881. The doctor in Florence, Dr. Horace Kelton, recorded that Thomas Miller died of complications from fever and a head wound sustained in a fall. Yet in a later affidavit, the doctor admitted he'd never examined the body. It was already buried by the time he arrived. Locals said Eliza insisted on a private burial behind the inn. The grave marker was a plain cedar board without inscription. When asked why she hadn't brought her husband to town, she replied simply, "The ground here knows him." After that, she grew increasingly withdrawn. She stopped attending Sunday services in Florence, and her letters to suppliers became curt, limited to lists and totals. By 1883, she ran the inn alone with only an occasional hand, a boy from the nearby ranch, Eddie Marsh, who carried water and chopped wood in exchange for supper. In his later statement, taken when he was an old man, he recalled that the widow often spoke to herself in the kitchen. Soft, like prayer, but never the Lord's words. It was during this period that the first disappearances began. A pair of freighters hauling ore between Tombstone and Globe vanished after lodging at the inn. A missing persons notice ran briefly in the Arizon, a weekly star. But the desert was full of accidents and lost men. No one connected their route to Widow Miller. What unsettled later investigators was her meticulous bookkeeping. The Territorial Archive, referencing a surviving ledger from her property, shows that she recorded every meal served and every payment accepted. On October 25, 1884, the night before the stagecoach incident, her handwriting trails off mid-sentence. 5 travelers, supper and rooms, quiet folk, no trouble this night, but... The next page is blank. When Deputy Jonas Fletcher returned after the vanishings, he inspected that ledger himself. In his report, he noted a brown stain along the lower margin, possibly spilled coffee, though the edges were darker, almost rust-colored. He requested permission to reopen the well behind the inn, but was denied by the county magistrate, who wrote, "No cause shown for trespass upon private land, evidence of harm unproven." Fletcher's frustration grew after learning of earlier incidents along that road, travelers who were last seen near the property and never reached the next post. Still, nothing could be proven. The Arizona Territory in the 1880s was a place of missing names and thin law, its courts burdened by land disputes and mine accidents. By December, the inn stood shuttered. Mail piled up at the Florence post office, addressed to Mrs. Eliza Miller, proprietor. She never returned to collect it. When a new deputy visited the property months later, he found only wind-blown dust across the porch and a single chair overturned beside the cold hearth. The bed linens inside were freshly laundered. On the kitchen table sat a folded note that read, "They wanted to stay. I made them comfortable." When spring returned to the Arizona Territory in 1885, the story of Widow Miller had already hardened into rumor. Locals spoke of her in past tense, though no one could say for sure what fate had met her or the 5 travelers who vanished that autumn night. Still, one man refused to let the case fade into folklore. Deputy Jonas Fletcher. Fletcher was young but methodical, the kind of lawman who carried notebooks rather than guns at his hip. His reports, later recovered in fragments from the Territorial Archives, paint a portrait of slow, deliberate obsession. He wrote, "I believe the inn hides what the widow could not carry with her. The desert preserves secrets in silence, but not forever." He returned to the property in March, this time without warrant or escort. The stage road was nearly overgrown, the signpost half buried in sand. The inn itself stood hollow but intact. Chairs were still stacked against the wall. The firewood box was filled. It looked less abandoned than paused. Fletcher recorded that the air smelled faintly of vinegar and iron, as though the rooms themselves were washed clean. Behind the kitchen he found the well, its stone rim cracked, the rope long rotted away. Drag marks ran from the back door to its edge, half erased by wind. He knelt beside it and dropped a lantern down. The light fell for several seconds before meeting something that shimmered like water. The deputy noted that when he called into the shaft, the echo came back wrong. Not hollow, but soft, like a voice answering from cloth. He requested the help of a local rancher, Hiram Blake, to lower him partway down. Together they rigged a pulley from a wagon axle. Fletcher descended about 15 feet before the lantern caught on what looked like timbers. An old platform, perhaps from when the well had been deeper. Beneath it, the light glinted off metal. He reached down and drew up. A small object, a brass locket, its hinge rusted shut. Inside was a photograph of a man and woman, both unsmiling, both wearing clothing a decade out of date. The inscription read, "Thomas Eliza, 1875. That night, as the 2 men camped near the property, Blake claimed he awoke to find the rope at the well's edge swaying gently, though no wind stirred. Fletcher returned to peer inside but saw only blackness. In his final report on March 19th, he wrote, "The well is older than the inn, older perhaps than this road. The bottom has not been reached. I recommend it be sealed." The county ignored his request. Shortly after, Fletcher left the territory altogether, moving east to join the U.S. Marshal's office in Texas. He died 3 years later, struck by fever, and his notes were boxed away in the courthouse attic, rediscovered only in 1912 when the Arizona Territory officially became a state. The rumors multiply. Within a year of Fletcher's inspection, more stories began to swirl. A drifter passing through Florence claimed to have seen a woman matching the widow's description in Silver City, New Mexico, boarding a freight train at dusk. Another report placed her near Prescott, living under the name Mrs. Ellis, running a boarding house for minors. No arrest ever followed. The witnesses contradicted each other on everything except her voice. Each described it as soft, polite, but hollow, like someone speaking from another room. By the 1890s, Widow Miller's Inn had entered the region's darker folklore. Ranch hands refused to camp within sight of the ridge. One story told that any traveler who rested there would dream of supper at a long table with a single empty chair waiting at the head. When they awoke, their boots would be damp with well water. Decades later, when the Arizona Historical Society compiled its first catalog of frontier disappearances, this case stood alone for one reason: no remains, no evidence, and no official cause ever recorded. The file closes with a single line added in pencil sometime around 1915. The road is gone, but the house stay. By 1892, the Arizona Territory was changing fast. The railroads were crawling westward, telegraph poles dividing open country into lines of connection and control. But there were still places where the law was more memory than presence, where stories like Widow Miller's hung in the air like dust that refused to settle. That year, a territorial marshal named Daniel Harker arrived in Florence to review unsolved cases from the previous decade. Among the faded files, one caught his attention: the vanishing at Black Creek Crossing. The report was incomplete, its last entry signed by Deputy Jonas Fletcher, who had long since died. Harker was a cautious man, less superstitious than most, and saw in the file a matter of unfinished procedure rather than mystery. 5 missing travelers, 1 missing innkeeper. He decided to reopen the case. The local sheriff, by then an old hand named Miles Godfrey, tried to dissuade him. "There's nothing left to find," he warned. "That land don't even take seed anymore." But Harker was determined. He gathered a small team, a deputy, a laborer, and a surveyor, and set out for the ruins in early May. The road was half buried beneath desert growth. They reached the ridge by noon and found the inn little more than a skeleton of timber and stone. The roof had collapsed inward, leaving the hearth and chimney standing like a monument. What startled them most was the smell, faint, sour, and familiar, as if something sealed long ago had begun to breathe again. Harker ordered the area around the old well cleared of brush. Beneath a foot of silt and rock, they uncovered remnants of a wooden frame, the same platform noted years earlier by Fletcher. The marshal had it lifted out, piece by piece. Below lay a hollow about 3 feet deep, half filled with mud and bone. Dr. Elias Corwin, the county physician, was summoned to examine the find. His written states, "Taiment survives in the territorial archives. Remains appear human, likely adult male, though long deteriorated. Several long bones bear straight incisions consistent with cutting by a fine-edged blade. Fragments of cloth identified as uniform material, possibly that of a deputy." The discovery was grim but decisive. Word spread quickly that they had found Fletcher himself. His badge, tarnished but legible, was recovered among the debris. The notion that the man who investigated the inn had perished there ignited the old fear anew. When the crew drained what remained of the well, they found not water but a layer of hardened earth and something else, wooden boards forming a narrow crate. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a small leather ledger bound with cord. The front cover bore a single initial carved into it, E.M., the widow's writing. The ledger's contents were brief, but chillingly precise. Each page contained dates, initials, and short descriptions in neat handwriting. One line read, "March 10th, 2 travelers, both quiet. The tall one prayed." Another, "April 17th, woman alone, shoes too fine for desert. She will not be missed." The final entry, dated October 25, 1884, simply read, "5 guests arrived, supper prepared. The road must stay quiet." Harker presented the evidence to the territorial court, but no prosecution could follow. The suspect had been missing for nearly a decade and was presumed dead. The case was closed again, this time marked unresolved, presumed concluded. Yet the find left its mark. The ledger went missing from the courthouse within a year. Some claimed it was stolen by collectors. Others whispered that it had been returned to the site in secret. Folklore rekindled. By the late 1890s, travelers through that region began to report new disturbances. Stage drivers claimed their horses would balk near the ridge after sundown, refusing to pass. A telegraph worker camped there in 1897 wrote in his diary, "Heard clinking of dishes, though no house stands here. Smelled bread baking and smoke, yet the air was cold." The Arizona Territory, still young and half lawless, had seen its share of violence. But this story lingered differently. Quiet, without bodies, without resolution. Even as the 20th century dawned, locals swore that when the moon fell over Black Creek Crossing, one could see faint lamplight flickering in the empty foundation, and a woman's silhouette waiting at the doorway as though expecting guests who would never arrive. By the time Arizona approached statehood in 1912, the tale of Widow Miller had become little more than a ghost story told by ranch hands to frighten travelers. The old inn site had long been swallowed by the desert, its stones scattered, its well choked with dust and sage. Yet the story refused to die entirely. It slept. Then, in early 1911, a clerk for the Territorial Records Office named Helen Krause was tasked with cataloging materials damaged in a courthouse flood. Among the warped ledgers and mold-blackened papers, she found one book bound in cracked brown leather, its cord still tied. The cover bore the initials E.M. Inside were the same terse entries Marshal Daniel Harker had described 20 years earlier. Lists of travelers, small notations, and the chilling final line, "5 guests arrived, supper prepared, the road must stay quiet." The ledger had somehow survived the courthouse fire of 1894 and the later flood, both events that had destroyed thousands of other documents. Helen Krause, a meticulous archivist, sent it to the new State Historical Commission in Phoenix for conservation. Within months, word of its rediscovery spread through local papers, reigniting public fascination with the case that had haunted the Arizona Territory for nearly 30 years. The Arizona Gazette ran a headline on April 12, 1911. "The Widow of Black Creek, Murderous or Mirage?" Reporters reprinted sections of the ledger, filling in gaps with speculation. One article claimed that the handwriting changed near the end, as if 2 people had written in the same book. Another claimed faint impressions beneath the last page formed a single word: below. The historian's examination. When statehood was officially granted in February 1912, a young historian named Dr. Lewis Farnham, recently appointed to the University of Arizona, requested permission to study the ledger. Achin was academic. He was writing a monograph on frontier disappearances in the Arizona Territory, but the material soon consumed him. Farnham compared the entries with surviving county registers and stage line manifests. His research confirmed that most of the names corresponded to real people, each recorded as missing within weeks of their supposed visit to the inn. None were ever found. In a lecture delivered that autumn, Farnham suggested the case illustrated the isolation and moral corrosion common to the outer territories. But privately, in letters to his colleague Dr. Robert Landon, he expressed unease. The handwriting betrays calmness, even tenderness. Whoever wrote these lines was not driven by madness or anger. It reads more like duty, an act repeated until habit made it sacred. In a subsequent letter, he added a stranger detail. Under ultraviolet light, faint traces of additional text appeared between the lines, phrases invisible in daylight. One fragment read, "They stay where the water once was." Shortly after, Dr. Farnham vanished. His wife reported him missing after he failed to return from a field trip to Florence. where he intended to visit the old Black Creek site. His wagon was later found 2 miles from the ridge, its horses grazing, lantern still burning. The desert wind had already erased any tracks. The pattern continues. After Farnham's disappearance, the ledger was sealed once again, this time in the Arizona State Archive under restricted access. But curiosity lingered. Every few years, a new researcher would petition to study the book. Each one, in turn, withdrew before completing their work. In 1924, an archivist wrote a brief memo for internal records. The ledger remains legible, though certain pages now appear altered. Faint dampness noted along the spine. Odor of iron and soil persistent. That odor, earthy and metallic, was the same described in reports from 1884 when Deputy Fletcher first entered Widow Miller's cellar. Some believed it was coincidence. Others whispered that the ledger itself carried the memory of that place. By mid-century, the case had settled once more into silence, filed among the forgotten crimes of the Arizona frontier. Yet for those few who had handled the book, the silence never felt empty. One clerk, interviewed years later, said she often dreamed of setting a table for unseen guests, 5 places, each waiting for someone who never arrived. By the 1950s, Arizona had been a state for nearly 40 years, but the desert still carried its old silence. Ghost towns like Gleason and Ruby stood hollow under the heat, and stories of lost travelers remained part of its quiet folklore. One of those stories, the Widow Miller affair, might have stayed buried for good if not for a journalist named Frank Mallory, a crime writer for the Tucson Weekly Courier. Mallory specialized in forgotten cases. He liked what he called the bones of history, records half erased, names without graves. While researching an article on the unsolved crimes of the Arizona Territory, he stumbled upon a single surviving reference in a 1912 archive index. Ledger, E.M. restricted. He sent a formal request to view it, and after months of silence, was finally invited to the State Archive under supervision. He described the experience in his notebook. The ledger was smaller than I expected, the leather soft with age, darker at the edges as though handled by wet fingers. Each page neat, confident. Not a killer's madness, but a housekeeper's routine. The archivist told him the book had been temporarily removed from state storage in 1949 for private study by an unnamed researcher, and was returned a year later under questionable circumstances. Its condition had worsened, pages warped, some entries faintly rewritten in fresh ink. The signature of the return courier was illegible. Mallory copied several pages by hand, including the last, where faint impressions hinted at an addition long after the ink dried. Under magnification, he discerned 5 words pressed into the paper without pigment. They will come again soon. When his article, The Widow's Ledger, appeared in the Courier on August 14, 1953, it drew immediate attention. Readers from Florence to Prescott sent letters claiming family members had vanished near the old road. Others swore. They had objects, keys, brooches, or spoons, believed to be from the inn. But the most curious response came from a private collector in Santa Fe, who wrote anonymously, "I believe I have what you seek." The widow's book was never alone. Mallory drove there 2 weeks later. The collector's revelation. The man who met him at the edge of town called himself Mr. Reeves, a former surveyor. He led Mallory to a small adobe house and produced a narrow box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were 3 thin volumes nearly identical to the one in the archive. Same binding, same initials, same smell of rust and damp earth. Reeves explained that he found them in 1948, buried near the dry creek bed below Black Creek Ridge while clearing brush. Each book contained similar entries, though shorter and scattered across years. July 2, 1879. 2 writers, supper and rest. October 11, 1880. The boy quiet now. He listens. May 1, 1882. The road louder each season. Must keep the quiet. One page included a list of initials, followed by the words, "Return to the earth, as agreed." Reeves had kept them hidden out of fear. He said the first night after finding them, His horses refused to approach the barn, and for weeks afterward he dreamed of knocking from beneath the floorboards. Mallory asked to borrow one volume for study. Reeves hesitated, then agreed under the condition that it be returned by hand within a fortnight. Mallory left that night, taking the smallest ledger. He never came back. The second vanishing, his car was found abandoned 2 days later on the road between Tucson and Florence. Doors locked, headlights dead. The passenger seat held a notebook open to a half-finished sentence. She was not alone in the house. Inside the trunk lay a single object wrapped in linen, a spoon, polished clean, engraved faintly with the initials E.M. The Santa Fe authorities questioned Reeves, but he swore he hadn't followed Mallory. The ledgers he'd kept were confiscated for investigation and vanished en route to Phoenix. By 1955, the case was officially labeled Missing Person, Presumed Dead. The Courier printed a brief obituary for their reporter, closing with a line that would echo the original 1884 file. He went searching for Widow Miller and joined her silence. In the summer of 1972, the Arizona Historical Society partnered with the University of Arizona to survey several forgotten settlement sites along the old stage routes. One of these was the overgrown ridge once called Black Creek Crossing, where the faint outline of Widow Miller's Inn still clung to the soil. The lead archaeologist was Dr. Hannah Corbett, a field researcher known for her careful, unsentimental approach to local lore. She had never heard of the case until a county archivist mentioned the inn where everyone vanished. When Corbett reviewed what little documentation survived, the deputy's 1884 notes, the partial court file, and a blurred photograph of the original ledger, she thought it worth a brief excavation. More for folklore than fact, she wrote in her project log. The dig began quietly. The site offered little more than scattered timber, a chimney foundation, and the collapsed outline of what might have been the well. Within 2 days, however, the team began uncovering odd remnants, pieces of ceramic dinnerware buried at deliberate depth, a row of rusted utensils arranged in a semicircle, and beneath them, a single button polished clean despite the decades of dust. The interns joked that they had found the widow's table, but Corbett's tone turned serious when the soil test results came back. The ground beneath the foundation contained high traces of sodium hydroxide, the same compound used historically in lye, the cleaning agent mentioned in early reports of the inn's strange smell. She noted in her journal, possible residue from preservation or dissolution. Confirms proximity to human occupation, possibly more. By the 5th day, one student excavating near the collapsed well struck something hollow. They unearthed a large iron pot sealed with wax and rope. When opened, it released a dense metallic odor, so strong the crew stepped back. Inside were several small objects, 5 iron keys, a cracked mirror, and what appeared to be folded parchment wrapped in oilcloth. The writing on the parchment was faint but legible. Across the top read, October 25th, 1884. They've all gone quiet again. Beneath that, the initials E.M. were written in a hurried, uneven hand, unlike the calm script of the known ledger. The aftermath of the dig. The discovery was enough to halt the excavation and summon county authorities. The pot, its contents, and the soil samples were taken to Tucson for analysis. Within a week, the university was instructed by the State Historical Commission to suspend work indefinitely. No public explanation followed, but correspondence between Corbett and her department chair hints at quiet interference from the Archives Division. They insist the material matches a sealed file. Recommend cessation to avoid duplication. I disagree. There's more here than record suggests. Corbett kept copies of her notes and photographs. 3 months later, she left the university altogether and moved to Santa Fe, where she began researching frontier domestic crimes for a book that never reached publication. In interviews decades later, her assistant Mark Albright recalled that she grew reclusive and refused to discuss the excavation at all. When pressed, she said only, "It wasn't the inn that frightened me, it was the quiet. It was too complete." Echoes in the soil. Locals near the ridge claimed the area remained uneasy after the dig. Surveyors reported instruments malfunctioning near the old well site, compasses spinning without pattern. One night watchman told of hearing crockery clinking softly from underground. When the county sealed the pit with concrete in 1974, a small plaque was briefly installed reading, "Historic Site, Black Creek Inn, Estonia 1878. Within weeks, vandals had defaced it, carving a single word across the metal, supper. The plaque was quietly removed and never replaced. For almost 20 years after the 1972 excavation, the Widow Miller case lay dormant again. The university kept silent. The Arizona Historical Society avoided comment, and the few locals who remembered the dig said little more than that the ridge had gone wrong afterward. Wind carried sand over the sealed pit until even the plaque site disappeared. But in 1991, an auction of private estate papers in Santa Fe brought the story back into the light. Among the boxes were research notes belonging to Dr. Hannah Corbett, the same archaeologist who had led the Black Creek Ridge excavation. The papers were sold anonymously to a collector, then donated to the University of New Mexico Library. Inside the weathered folders were maps, soil analyses, and a sealed envelope marked, "For review only if I don't return." The archivist opened it in 1992 and found 20 pages of typed reflection, apparently written after Corbett's departure from Tucson. The tone of the letter was rational at first. She recounted her excavation results and confirmed the chemical findings of sodium hydroxide, suggesting deliberate attempts at decomposition or sterilization. But midway through the account, her writing turned strange, tight, hurried, and uneven. The soil beneath the foundation isn't natural fill. It's layered, alternating clay and ash, as if something was packed down and replaced. When we reached the last layer, there was still warmth. Not heat, just warmth, as though the ground remembered. She described finding the second pot, the one the state allegedly removed from the site, and claimed there were faint engravings on its outer rim, 5 small crosses, arranged in a ring. Inside, she said, was a single page torn from a different ledger, dated October 24, 1884, the day before the vanishings. The line read, "The table is full, no one left to serve." Corbett wrote that she returned the face, fragment to the archives, but weeks later, when she checked the accession number, there was no record it had ever existed. Her final note was the most unsettling. "I am beginning to believe the ledger was not a diary, but instructions. She wasn't writing what happened, she was writing what must happen again." After that, Corbett vanished from public record. The Santa Fe address listed on her papers was later found empty, mail stacked at the door. A single typed sheet remained on her desk, reading only, "The quiet moves with the dust." Renewed curiosity. When news of Corbett's rediscovered papers reached the Arizona Republic, a reporter named Nora Vasquez wrote a small column connecting the widow's legend to early territorial patterns of disappearance. She mentioned the strange consistency between each retelling, 5 travelers, the supper, and the silence that followed, and compared it to other regional cases documented during the late 19th century. Among them, she cited the Arizona Territory's lawless reputation, referencing how the territorial court struggled to manage remote settlements before statehood. Her article brought a wave of correspondence from readers claiming to have found relics from the site, a cracked teacup, an old brooch, a rusted hinge. None were verified, but one submission stood out, a small sepia photograph showing a woman standing before a wooden building. The handwriting on the back read, "E.M. Florence, 1884. Vasquez sent the photo for analysis. The expert's conclusion matched others from that period. Authentic image, real exposure, and consistent with camera plates used in the Arizona Territory circa 1880 to 1885. The face, though slightly blurred, carried a faint smile and eyes that seemed to follow the viewer. That image ran alongside her second article, "The Widow Returns," published in 1993. Readers described feeling uneasy looking at it, claiming the background appeared to shift slightly when viewed under dim light. The quiet, once more. Shortly after the article's release, the archive holding Corbett's letters reported a break-in. Only the envelope marked, "For review only if I don't return," was missing. The thief was never found. By the following year, Vasquez resigned from journalism, citing nightmares and exhaustion. She refused interviews, but left one recorded statement in a 1995 radio segment. "If you go there, you'll understand. The air doesn't move right. It's as though the world pauses to listen." To this day, the ridge near Black Creek remains fenced off by the county, labeled a stability hazard. Yet those who drive past after dusk sometimes report seeing faint lamplight flickering in the sage, and a silhouette near the old chimney, still waiting, as if expecting guests who never made it home. By 2016, the Widow Miller story had almost vanished from Arizona's collective memory again. The ridge at Black Creek Crossing was fenced off and absent from maps, its coordinates quietly removed from public records after the road's disappearance. Yet history has a way of resurfacing, especially when curiosity meets silence. That year, independent documentarian Evan Lorimer began researching what he called ghost records, cases where archives contained evidence but no surviving explanation. In an old university database, he found the restricted entry BCR07, which led him to scattered reports about a vanished professor, a missing archaeologist, and an inn that supposedly never existed. Each file referenced the same name, Miller. Lorimer was drawn to the consistency. Every version ends with the same 5 notes, 5 people, 5 objects, 5 sounds, he said in a later interview. It wasn't a haunting, it was a pattern. He spent months tracing the story backward, from modern incidents to 1884, cross-referencing territorial newspapers, property deeds, and the Arizona Territory Census. In one brittle courthouse ledger, filed incorrectly under mineral rights, he found a page glued over another. When archivists steamed it loose, an older entry appeared beneath, dated October 22, 1884. E. Miller licensed to operate lodging and victuals at Black Creek Roadhouse, fee paid in full. On the reverse side, faint writing in pencil read, 5 approved, keep the road quiet. Lorimer took this as a sign of deliberate concealment. Someone knew, he told colleagues. Someone in the territorial office wrote her license like a ritual. The journey back to the ridge. Ignoring state restrictions, Lorimer and 2 assistants, Jamie Cross and Lena Ortiz, traveled to the sealed site in February 2017. They filmed everything on handheld cameras, planning to recreate the last known locations of Dr. Rhodes's equipment. The footage, later recovered from cloud storage, begins calmly, wind sweeping across flat sage, a chain-link fence, a concrete seal in the center marked with rusted bolts. At 9:14 p.m., Lorimer kneels by the concrete and places a small microphone near one of the cracks. "We'll just listen," he says. "No breaking, no digging. For several minutes, there is nothing, just static." Then, faintly, a metallic sound repeats 5 times. Cross whispers, "It's the same rhythm." Ortiz insists it's echo from wind or fence vibration. They pack up at 9:40 p.m. The next morning, when reviewing the audio, Lorimer notices an additional noise between the 4th and 5th tap, a dragging sound, followed by a single word spoken softly. "Stay." 2 days later, he disappears while transferring footage at his motel in Tucson. His room shows no struggle, only the faint scent of wet soil. The laptop continues uploading for nearly an hour after he vanished, stopping mid-file. The upload. Months later, a 37-second clip surfaces on an online archive under the anonymous title BCR Footage Final. It shows Lorimer's camera resting on the ground, lens pointed toward the ridge. The audio is quiet except for wind, then the clinking begins, 5 measured taps. On the 5th, a shadow passes briefly over the frame, though no person is visible. In the distance, a woman's voice says something indistinct, followed by a single thud. The image cuts to black. Experts later confirmed the metadata timestamp, February 18, 2017, 9:44 p.m. The clip was removed within 24 hours after an official takedown notice from the Arizona Department of Public Lands, citing unauthorized imagery of a restricted site. No explanation accompanied the notice. The final page. The year after Lorimer's disappearance, a new archivist sorting unprocessed state materials discovered a single loose sheet pressed between maps of the old Pinal County line. The paper matched the original EM ledger in texture and handwriting. Across the top, in faded ink, it read, October 25th. They came again. Below that, 5 names were listed, each ending with a date from 1953, 1972, 1991, 2007, and 2017. The last name was E. Lorimer. The archivist filed a report, but by the following week, the sheet had vanished from evidence. Only a photocopy remained, stamped, "Do not circulate." Since then, the site at Black Creek has been closed by federal order. Locals say no birds land there, and passing motorists claim their radios hiss briefly with a pattern of 5 metallic clicks before falling silent again. 5 notes, 5 absences, the same supper endlessly set, but never cleared. In 2020, a historian named Dr. Miriam Haskett began reviewing 19th century Arizona church archives for a study on colonial religious syncretism, the blending of Catholic and frontier spiritual customs. Buried among the microfilmed parish records from Florence Mission, she found a short entry dated October 1884, signed by Father Lucien Devereaux, a traveling cleric who ministered to isolated settlements. The passage was brief but startlingly familiar. Visited the woman at Black Creek who feeds the travelers. Her hospitality is courteous, her eyes unwell. She speaks of keeping the road quiet, says it was agreed long ago when the well was dug. I prayed for her and for those yet to pass this way. Haskett realized the note coincided exactly with the month of the widow Miller vanishings. She cross-checked Devereaux's other journals and found a second reference the following spring. Return to the road. The inn stands closed, ground newly turned by the door. I leave it to God, for she has made her covenant, and the desert has kept it. To a modern reader, the phrasing sounded metaphorical, but Haskett, fluent in Latin, noticed something deeper. The original translation of covenant came from the phrase pactum silentiae, pact of silence. It appeared several times in other missionary writings of the region, always near abandoned homesteads or destroyed stations along trade routes. Intrigued, she began comparing notes with Dr. Peter Shaw, an anthropologist specializing in local folk rites. Together, they unearthed mentions of a recurring ritual practiced by some isolated settlers between 1870 and 1890, a form of protective hospitality. The belief held that a host could barter the safety of their home or road by offering something, sometimes food, sometimes blood, to the stillness beneath the well. Most families abandoned the superstition when churches spread deeper into the territory. But one account, recorded in 1879, described a widow near Florence who continued the quiet meal yearly, though her husband was long gone. Haskett underlined that passage twice. The connection. In early 2021, Haskett obtained permission to examine restricted state files labeled BCR07, the same folder tied to the Rhodes and Lorimer disappearances. What she read unsettled her enough to write a confidential memo to the University of Arizona Historical Department. All evidence suggests the legend was rooted not in murder, but in ritual obligation. The ledger entries, "They stay where the water once was," may signify offerings. Each reappearance of the ledger corresponds with attempts to reopen the site, as though the act itself invites repetition. She stopped her investigation soon after. Colleagues recalled she began avoiding desert travel altogether. In one email sent days before resigning, she wrote, "I think the quiet isn't a haunting, it's maintenance. Something must feed the silence, so the road remains." The archival recording, later that same year, a digital technician cataloging Haskett's research drive discovered an audio file labeled simply Well Static 1. It lasted 48 seconds. The first half contained soft wind and microphone hiss, then faintly 5 metallic taps. After a pause, a woman's voice whispered in low Spanish, "La cena está lista." Translation: Supper is ready. The file was analyzed and archived under restricted access. No explanation accompanied it. To this day, Dr. Haskett's whereabouts remain uncertain. Her apartment lease ended quietly, mail uncollected. The last message sent from her phone contained only one sentence. "It's still hungry." In the early months of 2023, after several weeks of heavy monsoon rain, a small sinkhole opened near the old Black Creek Ridge site, right along the access road that skirted the restricted zone. It wasn't large, barely 6 feet across, but it exposed the first glimpse of the sealed earth since the 1970s. The land itself seemed to collapse in on a hollow space no one remembered existing. The first person to reach it was Ranger Daniel Cole, a field officer for Pinal County who had patrolled that desert stretch for more than a decade. He filed a maintenance log describing minor erosion at closed historical zone. 2 days later, he added a second note: sinkhole widening, smell of rust and wet ash, soil temperature higher than ambient. When Cole returned with measuring gear, he noticed faint impressions in the ground, a rough ring, almost circular, about 8 feet wide. At its center, the exposed dirt had hardened into a reddish crust, like old iron. He took photographs and collected 2 soil samples for the state lab. The first sample returned normal readings. The second, however, showed chemical traces of sodium hydroxide and organic hemoglobin, identical to the results from Dr. Rhodes's dig in 2007. The lab technician wrote, "Possible contamination from earlier field material," but added privately in her notes that the odor smelled wrong, like earth soaked in brine. Cole was told to seal the sinkhole temporarily with concrete fill, pending state review. Yet before the crew arrived, he made one last visit alone. In his field recorder, later found in his vehicle, his voice was calm but uncertain. "Standing at the rim. It's quiet again. I keep thinking about that sound they used to talk about, the clinking. I don't hear it. Not yet." A pause. Then he says softly, "No, wait." The rest of the audio contains 5 faint metallic taps, followed by what sounds like a slow breath close to the microphone. The file ends abruptly. Cole was discovered the next morning seated in his truck, engine off, eyes open. The coroner ruled it a heart attack. His hands were clenched around a small, rusted spoon engraved with the letters E.M. The Review. The incident reignited official interest. County engineers inspected the area, confirming that a cavity about 12 feet deep existed beneath the surface, directly beneath the old inn's foundation. The space contained a single slab of stone or concrete, smooth and circular, far older than the inn's documented construction. The team reported rhythmic tapping on their instruments when lowering equipment, though they assumed it was friction against the pit wall. Within a week, the sinkhole was filled, fenced, and classified again as unstable terrain, no access. The engineers signed non-disclosure forms, citing potential biohazard contamination. Still, word spread quietly among nearby ranchers. They said coyotes refused to cross the ridge after dark, and horses startled for no reason. A mechanic in Florence claimed his radio picked up faint interference, 5 repeating clicks, whenever he drove that road. The new archive entry. In May, the Arizona Historical Society added a fresh folder to its restricted collection. Case Reference BCR 23, Incident at Black Creek Ridge. The final line of the file summary reads, "Seismic monitors detect intermittent vibration at sealed coordinates, frequency irregular, consistent with metallic resonance. Duration, 5 beats every hour." The signature below is illegible, and so the pattern continued. Even now, under the desert's silent crust, the instruments still register faint, rhythmic tremors, 5 taps, then stillness, as if something beneath remembers the ritual. Those who work near the site swear the air feels heavier there, as though the land itself is holed.
Ing its breath, waiting for one more guest to arrive for supper.
In late 2024, a small team of independent investigators calling themselves Desert Vale Research announced online that they intended to document the true history of Black Creek Ridge. The group consisted of 4 members: Eli Garner, Sophia Dunn, Marcus Lee, and Talia Knox, each specializing in photography, historical mapping, or audio fieldwork. Their goal, they claimed, was to prove or disprove the Widow Miller legend once and for all. Despite multiple warnings from the county and the Arizona Historical Society, the team crossed into the restricted zone in September 2024, entering through a gap in the old fence line. They brought with them ground sensors, 2 drones, and a live broadcast feed for their online audience. The broadcast lasted 2 hours before cutting abruptly to static. The raw footage, later recovered from their backup server, begins with the team walking across open desert at dusk. The ground looks brittle, fissured by heat. A faint wind pushes dust across the ridge. They reach the concrete seal placed after the 2023 sinkhole, its surface now cracked again, a shallow depression forming in the center. Garner, the team's lead, narrates softly. No birds, no insects. The sound drops here. Look at the levels. Dunn responds, half joking. Maybe the quiet's haunted. At 43 minutes, one of the drones hovers over the depression and begins transmitting thermal images. The display shows a clear ring of colder temperature surrounding a single warm point directly in the middle. Garner kneels, places a contact microphone against the concrete, and listens. 5 taps, faint but deliberate, echo through the feed. He looks toward the camera and says, "It's answering." Moments later, the temperature sensor spikes. The center of the depression appears to pulse once, as if something beneath shifted. The camera feed wavers, the microphones distort into high static. Hen, for just 2 frames, the light from their lanterns flares against something smooth, stone or metal, bearing 5 engraved marks in a ring. Then the broadcast ends. The recovery. Authorities arrived 2 days later after a hiker reported abandoned vehicles near the access road. All 4 cars were found locked and empty, keys inside. Drone debris was scattered along the ridge, and the broadcast rig lay half buried in dust. The only physical evidence recovered from the scene was a small USB recorder still clutched in one hand of the fallen tripod operator, Marcus Lee. The file contained less than a minute of audio, the same tapping, 5 times, followed by a whisper, barely audible, "Set the table." The county coroner listed the cause of death for all 4 as environmental exposure, though their bodies showed no signs of dehydration or injury. The timeline suggested they had been missing only hours before discovery, yet medical reports estimated the onset of rigor mortis as several days old. The Vanishing files. The footage was impounded under federal supervision. The Arizona Historical Society released a short press statement calling the expedition a tragic case of trespass and misadventure, urging the public not to sensationalize the event. But in an internal memo later leaked by a technician, the Society noted, seismic sensors in the Black Creek region detected harmonic activity precisely matching the timestamps of the live broadcast. 5 pulses, duration 30 seconds. All further access to the ridge was suspended indefinitely. The government installed new fencing and motion-activated cameras around the perimeter. Local rumor says they watch not for intruders, but for movement from below. Even so, travelers still report strange experiences on the nearby road. Headlights dimming, radios clicking 5 times, dogs refusing to walk past the fence. And lattice. At night, when the desert wind goes still, some claim they can see faint light moving under the cracked concrete, flickering in rhythm, like the glow of a lantern carried through rooms long buried. In early 2042, the desert along Black Creek Ridge was quieter than ever. The county had abandoned road maintenance years earlier, and only survey drones crossed that land now. Most locals believed the site had finally been sealed for good, forgotten except by those who made its legend their obsession. But history has a way of unsettling silence. That spring, a construction crew expanding a fiber optic line near the ridge unearthed a rusted metal box about a meter below the surface. It was rectangular, soldered shut, and stamped faintly with the year 1974, the same year the county poured concrete over the old sinkhole. Inside, wrapped in layers of oilcloth, were a reel-to-reel audio tape, a folded map, and a handwritten label reading simply, Time capsule, do not reopen. The find was transferred to the Arizona Department of Records in Phoenix, where archivists began cataloging its contents. The reel tape was labeled Property of AHS Field Audio, Corbett, 1972, matching the archaeologist Dr. Hannah Corbett, who vanished decades earlier. When the tape was restored and played, the recording began with familiar field noise, wind, the click of her notebook, and her calm voice describing stratified layers of soil. Then, faintly in the background, came the same 5 metallic taps noted in nearly every report since 1884. After a pause, Corbett's voice returned, steadier, but quieter. I've reached the second layer. There's something smooth below, stone or concrete. The air feels heavy, warm. I think it's... Static swallowed the rest. A moment later, a new sound emerged, unlike the tapping, a low exhale, close to the microphone, followed by the faint scrape of metal against metal. The tape ended with her final words, distorted but unmistakable. It never ended. It just waits. The state archivist's report described the discovery as significant but inconclusive, yet within
days, the Department of Records received an inquiry from the U.S. Geological Survey's Southwest Division, requesting all data on subsurface anomalies recorded in the Black Creek area since 2007. The following month, the information was classified under Federal Environmental Containment Protocol 12.7, effectively removing it from public access. The declassified report, 2 years later, a declassified summary leaked through the Freedom of Information Act. It referenced a study titled Subsurface Harmonics and Thermal Signatures, Black Creek Ridge Sector. The findings described rhythmic seismic patterns detected across multiple years, always 5 vibrations per cycle, each lasting exactly 7 seconds. The report concluded with an unnerving observation. Activity shows correlation with recorded trespass events. Pattern dormant until surface disturbance occurs. No natural explanation identified. Attached was an aerial image taken in 2039, showing faint concentric rings emerging in the soil like ripples frozen mid-motion. The pattern matched the map recovered from Corbett's time capsule, 5 rings surrounding a central hollow labeled dining room. The report's final line, blacked out in most copies, could still be faintly read beneath the marker ink. Recommend area remain sealed indefinitely. Do not excavate. Do not feed the silence. The silence renewed. By late 2042, the ridge was declared permanently restricted under federal jurisdiction. Armed patrols began enforcing no-entry zones within 2 miles of the coordinates. Yet hikers along nearby trails claim they can still feel vibrations through the soles of their boots. 5 gentle pulses at dusk, recurring each evening like the desert's own heartbeat. Truckers who drive the highway parallel to the ridge report brief lapses in radio signal, followed by the sound of metal striking metal, 5 times, evenly spaced. Before static resumes. Most laugh it off as coincidence, but a few stop driving that road entirely. And somewhere deep under the sealed ground of what was once Widow Miller's Inn, the same rhythm continues, steady and patient, waiting for the next disturbance that will draw it back to the surface. In 2045, a family in Prescott, Arizona, donated a collection of 19th-century personal papers to the State Historical Society. Among them was a cracked leather journal belonging to Nathaniel Pike, a traveling preacher who, according to the Cochise County records, disappeared in October 1884, one of the 5 guests last seen at Widow Miller's Inn. The journal's final entries were known to researchers from older transcriptions, but this version contains several missing pages, stitched awkwardly back into the binding with coarse thread. They appeared to be written during Pike's last journey east from Florence toward Tucson, days before his stagecoach stopped at the inn. His handwriting grew uneven toward the end, lines slanting down the page. A storm rises from the west, sky the color of old pewter. We'll stop at a house run by a widow near the ridge. The driver says she keeps good bread and quiet rooms. May God watch over our rest. Then, 1 page later, the meal was kind, if strange. The woman bowed her head before serving as if to grace, but said no words I knew. The broth was sweet, not of any meat I could name. I felt warmth like prayer in my chest, but it did not fade. The following leaf was smeared with what looked like candle wax. A faint indentation beneath the lines revealed words pressed into the paper from a missing sheet. She asked if I would bless the well. After that, the writing stopped. The descendant's letter. Attached to the donation was a note from Pike's great-great-granddaughter, Eliza Grant, explaining how the journal had remained hidden in her family for generations. Her letter read, "My grandmother told me we were warned never to speak our name near Florence. She said our ancestor was claimed by the quiet. When I was a child, I would dream of a table set for 5. The woman at the head always smiled, though her face was blurred. He also included a photograph taken in 1968 of her grandfather standing by a dry well on their ranch land, nearly 200 miles from Black Creek Ridge. Carved faintly into the stone rim were the letters E.M., and beneath them, a date that shouldn't have existed, 1884. The DNA comparison. For verification, the Arizona Forensic Anthropology Lab conducted a routine DNA test on material from the well rim. Flakes of what they assumed was mineral residue. The results returned partial human mitochondrial sequences that matched the Pike family line within a 92% confidence interval. The lab's final note read simply, "Sample suggests transfer of organic matter consistent with touch or exposure, though the material predates subject lineage by over a century." How the preacher's genetic trace appeared hundreds of miles away remained unexplainable. But for historians studying the Widow Miller case, the implication was chilling. Something from that supper table had moved, carried outward into the desert, following the traveler's descendants like an echo. The quiet in the blood. After news of the find leaked, descendants of the other 4 missing travelers were quietly contacted for potential interviews. 2 families declined, citing old family warnings to leave the ridge alone. One descendant reported recurring dreams of a narrow room lit by oil lamps and the smell of hot iron. The State Historical Society locked the Pike Journal in cold storage soon after, labeling it Specimen 1884-P. But a digitized copy briefly appeared online before being removed. It ended with an unnumbered page written in a different hand, perhaps added by Widow Miller herself. 5 came and stayed. The road is quiet again. I will rest until the next are called. The ink bled so heavily through the paper that it appeared still wet. In 2047, a genealogist named Dr. Samuel Reeves published a short paper on forgotten settlers of the Arizona Territory. In a footnote almost overlooked, he mentioned tracing a surviving branch of the Miller family line through parish baptismal records in St. Louis, Missouri. One descendant, he wrote, had migrated back west in the 1890s under a married name, Eliza Martin. The resemblance of the name was striking, but what drew attention was an accompanying image, a tintype photograph labeled E. Martin, 1896. The woman in the picture looked impossibly similar to surviving images of widow Eliza Miller, same dark eyes, same solemn expression, though she should have been long dead by then. The publication caused a brief uproar in Arizona historical circles. Within months, a distant relative, Margaret Reeves, the genealogist's great-niece, came forward claiming to be the direct maternal descendant of the widow herself. She said the family never denied their lineage. They simply stopped using the Miller name because it made people uneasy. When questioned by journalists, Margaret, a quiet woman in her 60s, gave a calm but chilling response. "My grandmother always said we keep the silence. That's our duty." Pressed further, she added, "She didn't kill them. They just stayed too long." The Interview. A documentary crew interviewed Margaret later that year for a special titled The Widow's Road. The footage, though never aired publicly, was later described by one editor who saw the raw cut. In the video, Margaret sits at her kitchen table beneath a single lamp. As she speaks, her eyes drift occasionally toward the doorway, as if expecting someone to enter. She says, "It wasn't a curse, it was an agreement." The road took travelers, and she kept them safe, kept them still. That's all the quiet ever wanted. Stillness. When the interviewer asks what keeping them still meant, Margaret pauses for several seconds, then whispers, "It means they don't wander." The crew reported that as she said the final words, the camera's audio captured 5 faint metallic taps from somewhere behind the wall, steady, measured, unmistakable. Margaret did not react. The following day, she declined further participation. Weeks later, she was found dead in her home, slumped at her dining table. In front of her were 5 polished spoons arranged in a perfect semicircle, each engraved with a single letter. Together, they spelled E-Mill, the rest of the letters missing. The family confession, Dr. Samuel Reeves, shaken by the event, withdrew from public life. But a month after Margaret's funeral, a sealed envelope arrived at the Arizona Historical Society addressed in his handwriting. Inside was a confession written on old stationery. "The stories are true. We were never supposed to speak of it. The silence isn't death, it's continuity. Each generation keeps the road quiet in its own way. It finds us when the noise grows." Attached to the letter was a photograph of a small stone marker recently uncovered on family land outside Prescott. The inscription, though eroded, could still be read under angled light. E.M., Keeper of the Quiet Road, 1884. So, after more than a century, the Miller line still existed, tied not just by blood, but by the strange duty of maintaining that silence, and perhaps, in their own way, honoring the same ritual their ancestor began, feeding the stillness so that the road could remain safe and the world could forget what lay beneath. By 2049, researchers at the University of New Mexico began noticing a disturbing statistical overlap while cataloging unsolved 19th-century disappearances across the American Southwest. The project, led by Dr. Peter Havelock, mapped every known case between 1870 and 1895 where 5 or more travelers vanished without trace. The pattern was unmistakable. The clusters formed a near-perfect line stretching from Santa Fe through Florence, Arizona, and down toward the old Mexican border. The historians called it the Quiet Road. When plotted on modern terrain data, the line intersected precisely with former stage routes and wagon paths, roads that once carried miners, soldiers, and merchants through the territories. What startled the team most was how often those routes included references to inns or lodgings kept by widows, temporary rest stops run by women whose husbands had died in the mines or wars. Each site carried local rumors: the house where no one left, the supper that lasted too long, or the well that never ran dry. Digging into the Arizona Territory archives, Dr. Havelock's group uncovered at least 6 reports of similar establishments abandoned after unexplained vanishings. None survived beyond 1890, and most records were destroyed by fire or deliberate removal. Only Widow Miller's Inn remained well documented. One entry in a San Carlos mission ledger dated 1885 read, "5 houses of rest, 5 women who serve the silence, 1 remains faithful." The handwriting matched that of Father Lucien Devereaux, the priest who had visited the Widow Miller months before her disappearance. The covenant pattern, cross-referencing Devereaux's journal with property deeds, revealed that all 5 houses of rest were built near wells or natural springs that had gone dry long before settlement. According to folklore collected from descendants of local tribes, such sites were called quiet mouths, places where the earth listens. Havelock proposed that the women who ran these inns may have shared more than circumstance. They might have practiced a ritual exchange, passed through whispers among frontier widows. The phrase, "keep the road quiet," could have meant offering stability to travelers through ritualized death, a perverse kind of hospitality, ensuring safe passage for others. The idea horrified his students, but the data persisted. In every cluster, 5 names appeared. 5 vanished travelers, always 5. One intern joked that if you drew the line of disappearances on a map and extended it eastward, it cut directly through Prescott, the final resting place of Margaret Reeves, The widow's descendant. The letter from nowhere. Shortly after presenting his findings, Dr. Havelock received an unmarked envelope at his office. Inside was a single page of aged paper bearing 5 small ink dots in a circle and one line written in careful cursive. The road is quiet again. Thank you. No return address. Postmark illegible. Within weeks, Havelock suspended his research and left the university, citing ill health. His colleagues later found that all his files on the project had been wiped clean. The drives contained only one audio fragment left behind on the departmental server, 5 clear metallic taps, evenly spaced, followed by the faint creak of a chair. Echoes across the desert. Even now, drivers along the forgotten stretches between Florence and Tucson speak of hearing those same 5 metallic sounds echoing beneath their tires when the wind dies. Some say the rhythm matches their heartbeat for a moment before vanishing. Others claim that, if they stop their vehicles and listen closely, the tapping slows, almost invitingly, like cutlery against porcelain somewhere below the sand. And in small desert towns along the route, people say, "He'll leave a bowl of water by their doors on hot nights," muttering a phrase passed down from nameless ancestors. For the road and for the quiet. They don't always know what it means, but they say it anyway. By 2052, nearly a century and 7 decades had passed since the night 5 travelers vanished at Widow Miller's Inn. The ridge itself, now fenced by federal order, was rarely visited. Its coordinates omitted from maps, its very mention discouraged in historical writing. Yet a story like this never really ends. It simply waits for someone who can't leave silence alone. That year, a small unit of environmental engineers from the Bureau of Land Reclamation was tasked with inspecting a line of aging seismic sensors near the restricted zone. Most of the team treated it as a routine assignment, but one technician, Amira Locke, a graduate from Northern Arizona University, recognized the coordinates immediately. She'd grown up hearing whispers about the quiet road and the woman who fed the stillness. Her logbook entry for June 8th reads plainly, "Arrived at perimeter, 1812. Air temperature higher near the ridge. No wind. Everything feels like waiting." The crew installed new batteries and began recalibrating the sensors. Around sunset, their instruments started registering faint rhythmic tremors, 5 vibrations every 70 seconds. The senior engineer dismissed it as sensor feedback, but Locke recorded a short sample for later analysis. When played back in the control tent, the sound was too regular to be mechanical. Each pulse was accompanied by a metallic echo, like something striking stone. Between the 4th and 5th beats, a low harmonic tone appeared, almost a voice, barely audible, forming a single syllable, home. The night transmission. Locke copied the data to a secure channel and continued working. Around 2300, she stayed behind after the others had packed up. Her final voice memo, uploaded automatically to the Bureau's satellite log, began with a long silence, then her whisper. "It's louder now, coming from below. It sounds like dishes being set." The feed cut off at 2307. The next morning, her equipment and personal effects were found exactly where she'd left them. Chair upright, radio still on, headset coiled neatly. The ground nearby showed a shallow depression, as if the soil had sunk only an inch. The sensors continued transmitting for several days, repeating the same sequence, 5 clear metallic taps every hour, followed by a single breath. Then, on the 7th day, all signals ceased simultaneously. The Bureau sealed the area again and reclassified it under Geological Containment Zone 12B. The official report cites ground instability and instrument malfunction. No mention was made of Amira Locke's disappearance. The end that isn't. The Arizona Historical Society quietly added one more page to the Widow Miller file, now 168 years old. It contained no analysis, only an updated timeline of vanishings, 1884, 1892, 1912, 1943, 1953, 1972, 2007, 2017, 2023, 2024, and 2052. Next to the final date was a single dash, as if waiting for the next entry. Some say the rhythm never stopped. Truckers still report 5 knocks echoing faintly through their cab walls when they drive that lonely stretch of desert road. Campers who stray too close to the fenced ridge describe hearing footsteps circling their tents, always 5 steps before silence returns. And if you visit that part of Arizona on a windless night and listen closely, truly listen, you might hear it too. Faint, careful, deliberate. The sound of silver on porcelain. The sound of a table being set for one last supper. 5 taps. Then stillness. Thus ends the file of 1884 Arizona Territory, the night of the vanishing guests at Widow Miller's Inn. None made it home.